On an ordinary spring morning in London, a quiet neighborhood was torn apart by unimaginable violence. A man armed with a samurai sword turned the streets into a scene of terror, leaving heartbreak and unanswered questions. This is the story of chaos, courage, and lives forever changed. In the early hours of April 30th, 2024, the streets of Hainaut were silent. It was the kind of suburban quiet that Londoners cherish. Rows of houses still sleeping, the distant hum of buses beginning their routes, and the promise of another ordinary morning. But as dawn settled over the borough, a chain of events unfolded that would transform that ordinary day into one of the most chilling episodes in recent British crime history. At the center of it all was a man named Marcus Arduini Manzo, a former Amazon delivery driver whose descent into paranoia and violence culminated in a rampage that shocked the nation. Marcus was a man of contradictions. Born in Brazil, holding Spanish nationality, and having moved to the UK in 2013, his early years in London were unremarkable. Neighbors and casual acquaintances often described him as polite, quiet, even reserved. He worked ordinary jobs, including as a delivery driver, and engaged in mixed martial arts training. Yet beneath this exterior lay a mind increasingly distorted by dark beliefs and troubling obsessions. Marcus spent long hours consuming conspiracy theories online, fascinated by far-right rhetoric, anti-vaccine movements, and incel ideology. His browser history reflected a growing detachment from reality, spiraling into an obsession with violence and fantasies of power. He was particularly captivated by Japanese samurai culture, often training with long blades, and he began to cultivate an image of himself as a warrior outside the bounds of society. By 2024, those close enough to notice began to see signs of deepening instability. He complained of voices, of unseen forces draining his energy, of visions that disturbed his sleep. Friends drifted away, uneasy at his increasingly erratic behavior. Alone in his home, he sought spiritual practices to silence the noise, dabbling in yoga, meditation, and even retreats abroad. But the peace he searched for never arrived. Instead, paranoia consumed him. Convinced of supernatural forces, Marcus grew more volatile, self-medicating with cannabis and hallucinogens, which only sharpened his delusions. On the night before the attack, his fragile psyche collapsed entirely. Hours before his rampage, Marcus killed his own pet cat, a creature he named Wizard. Later, he would claim that voices told him the animal was draining his life force, a grotesque reflection of his fractured mind. He skinned the cat and left its remains behind, a chilling precursor to the violence to come. By dawn, he had armed himself with 2 samurai-style swords. Whatever logic tethered him to ordinary life had disintegrated. He set out with the belief that he was on a mission, one that only he could understand. The attack began in shocking fashion. As the streets of Hainaut stirred to life, Marcus drove a white Vendome Lang close and deliberately rammed it into a pedestrian, Donato Iule. Donato was an unsuspecting passerby, simply beginning his day. The impact hurled him to the ground, disoriented and stunned. Before he could recover, Marcus climbed out of the vehicle, sword in hand, and struck at Donato's neck with the precision of someone who had rehearsed such movements in his fantasies. By sheer chance and the resilience of his victim, Donato survived the slashing blow, though gravely injured. It was the first sign of the chaos Marcus would unleash, an unprovoked act of savagery that shattered the stillness of the morning. But the true horror of the rampage revealed itself moments later. Just a short distance away, 14-year-old Daniel Angerin was walking to school. He carried his backpack, headphones resting on his ears, his mind likely filled with the ordinariness of a school day ahead. He was steps from his home, within sight of safety, when Marcus intercepted him. Without hesitation, Marcus launched into a frenzied assault, slashing Daniel repeatedly with his sword. The boy's injuries were catastrophic: head, face, and neck torn by the blade in wounds that doctors would later describe as unsurvivable. Daniel's life ended in the very place where he should have been safest, a brutal reminder of how quickly innocence can be destroyed. The randomness of Daniel's murder amplified the horror. He had no connection to Marcus, no reason to be targeted. He was simply a child on his way to school, caught in the path of a man unraveling before the eyes of a community. News of his death would ripple far beyond Hainaut, sparking national grief and outrage. But in that moment, his family's world collapsed. Their son, their brother, their friend was gone, snatched from them in an act of meaningless violence. Marcus's rampage did not end there. Fueled by whatever voices and delusions drove him, he pushed forward, prowling the streets with his sword. Every step carried the threat of further destruction. For Marcus, this was no longer the world of ordinary people. It was a stage for the chaos inside his mind. He broke into a nearby home, forcing his way into the residence of Henry de los Rios Polania and his partner, Cindy Arias. Their young daughter was asleep in the next room as Marcus burst into their bedroom, blade gleaming. With chilling calm, he questioned them about their beliefs, shouting disturbing religious phrases before turning his violence upon Henry. Slashing and striking, he left the father bleeding, while Cindy and the child watched in terror. In an almost surreal twist, it was the cries of the couple's daughter that shifted Marcus's attention long enough for them to survive. He left their home as abruptly as he had entered, moving on to new targets, leaving behind a family whose sanctuary had been violated in the most terrifying way imaginable. By this point, the Metropolitan Police were swarming the area. Calls of a sword-wielding man attacking civilians in broad daylight had spread panic across the neighborhood. Officers rushed to intercept, but Marcus was prepared to fight even them. Among the first to confront him was PC Yasmin Meckham Whitfield. With extraordinary courage, she pursued him through alleys and narrow streets, determined to stop his path of destruction. But Marcus turned on her, sword slicing into her body. Despite her injuries, Yasmin's bravery kept him occupied long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Later, Inspector Molloy Campbell would also face him directly, suffering his own wounds in the struggle. For nearly 20 minutes, chaos reigned in Hainaut. Residents peered from windows in disbelief, children were rushed indoors, and police sirens wailed as officers converged. At the center of it all, Marcus moved with terrifying intent, as though guided by an inner script that no one else could read. Only when armed response units arrived was he finally subdued, wrestled to the ground, and taken into custody. The rampage was over, but the damage was done. A boy lay dead, several others wounded, and an entire community shaken to its core. In the hours that followed, details of the attacker began to emerge. Marcus Arduini Manzo was no faceless figure but a man with a history, a man who had once delivered packages door to door, blending into the ordinary fabric of the city. Now he was the face of a senseless atrocity. His first words in custody spoke of amnesia, voices, and hallucinations. He compared himself to a professional assassin, invoked samurai traditions, and even likened his actions to the fictional battles of the Hunger Games. Investigators would later uncover a digital trail of conspiracy theories, extremist content, and disturbing obsessions. It became clear that this was not a random explosion of violence, but the culmination of years of delusion, paranoia, and self-destruction. Part 1 of the story closes with the image of a community in shock. Parents holding their children closer, survivors grappling with wounds both visible and invisible, and police piecing together the horror of what had just unfolded. For the family of Daniel Angerin, the loss was immeasurable. For others like Donato, Henry, Cindy, and the officers who faced Marcus, survival carried its own heavy burden. And for Britain, the Hainaut sword attack would stand as one of the darkest reminders of how quickly ordinary life can descend into terror. In the aftermath of the Hainaut rampage, the questions began almost immediately. Who was Marcus Arduini Manzo? How did a man once known as a delivery driver and martial arts enthusiast transform into the architect of such horror? To understand the events of that April morning, investigators and journalists retraced the path of his life, peeling back the layers of his identity to expose the contradictions that defined him. Born in Brazil in the late 1980s, Marcus grew up in a family that eventually relocated to Spain, where he obtained citizenship. His early years did not stand out as especially troubled, though acquaintances later recalled a young man who often seemed restless, dissatisfied, and always searching for something more. By 2013, Marcus had moved to the UK, settling in East London. At first, his life resembled that of countless other immigrants. Modest work, casual friendships, and a gradual attempt to build a life in a new country. He worked various jobs, including stints as an Amazon delivery driver, and trained in mixed martial arts, finding in combat sports both discipline and identity. On the surface, Marcus appeared to be living an ordinary existence. But behind that facade, cracks were already forming. As the years passed, Marcus began retreating into the world of the internet. Hours stretched into days as he consumed videos and forums dedicated to conspiracies. Flat Earth theories, claims of chemtrails poisoning the skies, anti-vaccine propaganda, and content that vilified modern society. He drifted toward far-right rhetoric, where narratives of purity, strength, and domination seemed to echo his own inner turmoil. Alongside these obsessions grew his fascination with samurai culture. He began practicing with swords, collecting blades, and weaving together a fantasy in which he was no longer an ordinary man but a warrior outside the confines of the modern world. At the same time, Marcus struggled with mental instability. Friends who once trained alongside him in martial arts noticed his behavior becoming erratic. He spoke about hearing voices, about unseen forces attacking him, and about energies being drained from his body. These were not fleeting remarks but persistent claims, suggesting a mind losing its grip on reality. He sought refuge in spiritual practices, traveling to India, experimenting with meditation and yoga, and even consuming hallucinogenic substances like ayahuasca in search of enlightenment. Instead of clarity, these pursuits seemed to deepen his confusion. Cannabis use became a regular part of his life, and medical experts later argued that it played a significant role in triggering psychotic episodes. The days leading up to the attack revealed a man spiraling beyond reach. Those who interacted with him described his paranoia as overwhelming. He isolated himself. His world narrowed to the conspiracies he read and the voices only he could hear. His cat, Wizard, had become his only companion. Yet even that relationship ended in madness. On the night before his rampage, Marcus killed and skinned the animal, claiming afterward that voices instructed him to do so because the cat was stealing his energy. It was an act so grotesque that it served as a clear warning of what was to come. But there was no intervention, no one there to stop him from descending further. Investigators later uncovered a disturbing digital trail on his devices. He had consumed content celebrating violence, studied samurai traditions, and idolized fictional assassins. He compared himself to warriors of old, creating an alter ego in which he was a professional killer engaged in battles against unseen enemies. At the same time, his search history revealed admiration for authoritarian figures, including Adolf Hitler, and sympathy with extremist views that glorified destruction. He was steeped in incel ideology, convinced that society was broken and that he was its victim. Each new piece of evidence painted a picture not only of a man detached from reality but one actively feeding his darkest impulses. The rampage in Hainaut was not a spontaneous act but the culmination of these years of obsession and mental decline. When Marcus climbed into his van that morning, swords in tow, he was carrying not just weapons but a carefully nurtured fantasy. He saw himself as a warrior on a mission, and the streets of Hainaut became his battlefield. Forensic psychiatrists would later debate whether his actions were the product of schizophrenia, substance-induced psychosis, or a dangerous combination of both. But for the victims, the labels meant little. What mattered were the scars left behind. The families and survivors struggled to process what had happened. For the parents of Daniel Angerin, grief was immeasurable. Their 14-year-old son had been on the cusp of his future, walking to school, dreaming of the life ahead. Instead, they were forced to bury him, their home transformed into a site of mourning. For Donato Iuyul, survival was accompanied by trauma. He bore the physical scars of the sword attack on his neck, but even more profound was the memory of being hunted by a stranger wielding a blade. Henry de los Rios Polania and Cindy Arias faced the haunting reality that their own bedroom, the place where they should have been most secure, was invaded by a man intent on violence. Their daughter's cries had saved their lives, but that moment would remain etched into their memory forever. For the officers who confronted Marcus, the ordeal was equally scarring. PC Yasmin Meckham Whitfield was hailed as a hero, her pursuit of Marcus courageous even as she suffered severe wounds. Inspector Molloy Campbell, too, had placed himself in harm's way, embodying the risks that officers take to protect the public. Both carried the injuries and trauma of that day, symbols of the bravery required when chaos erupts. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they were struck by the speed with which destruction unfolded. In just 20 minutes, Marcus had turned a quiet neighborhood into a war zone. The randomness of his choices, one man walking to work, one boy heading to school, one family asleep in their home, officers responding to a call, underscored the terrifying unpredictability of the attack. There was no pattern, no vendetta, only the blind fury of a man consumed by his delusions. The wider community of Hainaut struggled to comprehend how such violence had come to their doorstep. Candlelit vigils were held, flowers piled on street corners, and tributes to Daniel spread across schools and social media. Residents spoke of a loss of innocence, a sense that their neighborhood would never be the same. Parents held their children closer, wary of letting them walk alone. The shock reverberated far beyond London, with national leaders and commentators grappling with the unsettling fact that such savagery had erupted in a suburban street. Meanwhile, the legal process loomed. Marcus's arrest marked only the beginning of a long and complex journey through the courts. In custody, he rambled about forgotten memories, claimed that voices had commanded his actions, and compared himself to figures from mythology and fiction. He described himself as an assassin, spoke of samurai codes, and referenced films like The Hunger Games, as though his rampage had been a performance staged for an invisible audience. Forensic experts were called upon to assess his mental state, while prosecutors began building a case to prove his responsibility. The debate that followed would center on one crucial question. Was Marcus a man whose actions were driven by severe mental illness, or was he responsible for his choices, his psychosis self-induced by years of voluntary drug use? It was a question that would divide opinion, set the stage for tense courtroom battles, and ultimately determine whether he would be held fully accountable for the devastation he caused. As the community mourned and the survivors tried to heal, the stage was set for a legal reckoning. Marcus's life story, his obsessions, his crimes, and his claims of psychosis would all be scrutinized under the harsh light of the courtroom. And for the families who had lost and suffered so much, the trial offered the hope of justice, even if it could never undo the horror of that April morning. When the case finally reached the Old Bailey, it carried with it the weight of an entire community's grief, fear, and unanswered questions. The courtroom became the stage where Marcus Arduini Monzo's actions would be dissected in relentless detail, and where jurors would be asked to determine not only what had happened in those 20 minutes of carnage, but why. From the very first day, the trial revealed the stark clash between two narratives. One painting Marcus as a man who had surrendered to drug-induced delusions, fully responsible for the devastation he caused. The other portraying him as a deeply ill figure whose psychosis had taken complete control. Prosecutors opened with a clear and chilling account of the attack itself. They traced Marcus's steps from the moment he rammed his van into Donato Iuyul, to the killing of Daniel Angerin, the intrusion into the De Los Rios household, and the assaults on officers. Each moment was reconstructed with precision, supported by CCTV footage, forensic evidence, and the testimony of survivors. For the jurors, it was impossible to ignore the sheer brutality of the sequence. The image of Daniel, a 14-year-old boy with his backpack and headphones, walking innocently to school, was invoked repeatedly, a reminder that this trial was about more than psychiatric labels. It was about human lives cut short and scarred forever. The defense countered by painting Marcus as a man consumed by psychosis. They described him as someone who had long struggled with paranoid delusions, hearing voices and believing that unseen forces were manipulating his body and mind. They argued that, by the time of the attack, Marcus had lost all capacity to distinguish reality from hallucination. To underscore their claims, they pointed to the killing of his cat Wizard, a grotesque act, but one that, in their view, showed the depth of his mental collapse. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified that Marcus exhibited clear signs of psychosis, that his ramblings about samurai codes and conspiracies reflected a disordered mind, and that he had not been in control when he stepped onto the streets of Hainaut with a sword in his hands. Yet the prosecution had its own experts, and their testimony proved pivotal. They argued that Marcus's psychosis was not the inevitable result of a chronic mental illness like schizophrenia, but was instead brought on by his heavy use of cannabis. They highlighted his online footprint, his deliberate consumption of violent material, his glorification of killers, his fascination with extremist ideologies, and presented it as evidence that his attack was shaped by choices, not just delusions. They reminded the jury that Marcus had been capable of planning. He armed himself with multiple swords, drove deliberately into a victim, and then carried out a sequence of attacks across different locations. These, they argued, were not the chaotic spasms of an unconscious mind, but the deliberate actions of a man who knew what he was doing. The testimonies of survivors added a deeply human dimension to the trial. Donato Iul recounted the terrifying moment when he was struck by the van, then slashed at the neck. He spoke of the panic, the blood, the confusion of being attacked without warning. Henry de los Rios and Cindy Arias described the horror of waking to find Marcus in their home, a sword flashing in the dark, and the desperate fight for survival while their child cried out. Their words carried the rawness of trauma, forcing the courtroom to confront not only what had been done, but the scars that would never fade. Police officers Yasmin Meckham-Whitfield and Molloy Campbell also took the stand, describing the chase, the confrontation, and the moment the blade struck. They embodied the courage of those who had faced Marcus directly, but their testimony also underscored the randomness of his rage. Anyone who crossed his path that morning had become a target. When Marcus himself addressed the court, his words only deepened the sense of unease. At times he claimed to remember nothing of the attack. At others he spoke of being an assassin, of following samurai traditions, of living inside a reality shaped by video games and films. He rambled about conspiracies, compared himself to characters in the Hunger Games, and described his actions as though they were part of some distorted performance. For many listening, it was impossible to tell where the act ended and the delusion began. Claim diminished responsibility. After weeks of testimony, they returned their verdict. Marcus Arduini Manzo was guilty of the murder of Daniel Angerin. He was guilty of multiple counts of attempted murder, grievous bodily harm, aggravated burglary, and possession of offensive weapons. The verdict reflected not only the brutality of his crimes but the belief that he bore responsibility for them. Sentencing followed soon after, and the courtroom once again filled with tension. The judge described Marcus's actions as savage and unprovoked, emphasizing the devastating impact on victims and the wider community. He acknowledged the debates about Marcus's mental state, but made clear that the law could not ignore the role of self-inflicted intoxication. Then came the sentence: life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years before eligibility for parole. It was a punishment designed to reflect the gravity of the crimes and to ensure that Marcus would never again be free to walk the streets unchecked. For the families, the verdict and sentence brought a measure of justice but not closure. Daniel Angerin's parents left court knowing that no legal outcome could restore the life of their son. They spoke of his kindness, his diligence, his promise for the future, all stolen in an instant. Donato Iul expressed gratitude for survival but also admitted to ongoing nightmares and fear. Henry and Cindy, their young daughter still traumatized by the intrusion, began the long process of rebuilding their sense of safety. The police officers, commended for their bravery, continued to recover both physically and emotionally. In the community of Hainaut, the scars lingered. Streets that had once been ordinary suburban roads were now forever linked with horror. Memorials to Daniel remained, candles and flowers marking the spot where he had fallen. Schools and churches organized vigils, creating spaces for collective mourning. Conversations about mental health, drug use, and online radicalization gained urgency, as residents and officials alike sought to understand how such violence could erupt seemingly without warning. Beyond Hainaut, the case reverberated across the UK. It became a flashpoint in broader debates about cannabis use, with politicians and campaigners pointing to Marcus's self-induced psychosis as evidence of the drug's dangers. Others focused on the failings of mental health support, arguing that warning signs, Marcus's paranoia, his bizarre behavior, his killing of his cat, should have prompted intervention. Still others highlighted the dangers of online radicalization, where isolation and obsession can twist vulnerable minds toward violence. The trial had resolved Marcus's legal fate, but the questions it raised about society's responsibilities remained unsettled. As the months passed, the story of the Hainaut sword attack faded from headlines, but it lived on in the memories of those who had been touched by it. For some, it became a symbol of resilience, of a community that had come together in the face of terror, of survivors who had endured the unendurable, of police who had risked their lives to protect others. For others, it was a cautionary tale about the fragility of ordinary life, how quickly a normal morning could transform into chaos. Marcus Arduini Manzo now spends his days behind the walls of a high-security prison, his fantasies of samurai battles and assassin alter egos reduced to the silence of a cell. His name, once unknown, is forever tied to the tragedy of April 30th, 2024. For the families and survivors, his imprisonment may offer some comfort, but it cannot erase the images of that morning. The sound of footsteps on a suburban street, the gleam of a blade in the early light, the life of a boy taken too soon. The Hainaut rampage remains a haunting reminder of the thin line between ordinary life and extraordinary violence. It is a story of one man's descent into paranoia and delusion, but also of the resilience of those who survived, the bravery of those who stood against him, and the enduring grief of a family whose child never came home. Long after the courtroom doors closed, the legacy of that morning continues, etched into the streets of Hainaut and the hearts of those who lived through it. A simple appliance delivery turned into one of Florida's most shocking crimes, when a trusted worker brutally murdered a 75-year-old grandmother inside her own home. This is the chilling story of betrayal, violence, and justice that will leave you questioning how safe an ordinary day truly is. In the summer of 2019, the city of Boca Raton, Florida, was like countless other suburban communities in the United States. Known for its coastal beauty, affluent neighborhoods, and sense of safety, it was the kind of place where residents felt secure in the routines of everyday life. Among them was 75-year-old Evelyn Smith-Udall, a retired college administrator who had chosen Boca Raton as the setting for her golden years. Her days were filled with family visits, reading, community engagement, and the quiet joys of retirement. She had spent decades in higher education, respected for her dedication to students and admired by colleagues who remembered her as intelligent, meticulous, and deeply compassionate. Evelyn was also a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother. Her warmth and hospitality were well known, and friends often described her as someone who made others feel safe and valued. August 19, 2019, began as an ordinary Monday for Evelyn. That morning she was expecting the delivery of a new washer and dryer, purchased from Best Buy. Like many customers, she had arranged for installation through a third-party contractor, never imagining that something so routine could unravel into horror. The delivery was assigned to John's Appliance City, a company contracted to handle installations in the area. 2 men were dispatched, a lead installer and his assistant, a 21-year-old named Jorge Dupre Lachazo. For Evelyn, it was a simple matter of opening her home to workers, allowing them to do their job, and then resuming her day. For Jorge, however, the events that unfolded would mark the end of his freedom and the beginning of a chilling criminal case that would grip South Florida. When the delivery truck pulled up to Evelyn's Boca Raton home, everything appeared normal. The 2 workers carried the appliances inside, maneuvering them into the laundry room. The lead installer focused on the technical aspects, making sure the machines were connected properly. Jorge's role was secondary. He was there to assist with lifting, moving, and explaining the operation of the new units once the installation was complete. Evelyn, ever polite, engaged them with kindness, offering the same respect and courtesy she would to anyone who crossed her threshold. There was no conflict, no argument, no warning of the violence that would soon erupt. At some point during the visit, the lead installer stepped outside to make a phone call, leaving Evelyn alone with Jorge. It was a gap of only a few minutes, but in that brief span, the atmosphere shifted. What occurred next seemed inexplicable to everyone who later tried to piece together the crime. For reasons never fully understood, Jorge launched into a sudden and brutal attack. He grabbed a rubber mallet, a tool taken from the delivery truck, and struck Evelyn on the head. The blows were severe, shattering the sense of safety inside her home. Evelyn collapsed under the assault, her trust cruelly betrayed by the young man standing before her. But the violence did not end there. In a disturbing escalation, Jorge retrieved an accelerant, believed to be paint thinner or another flammable substance, and poured it onto Evelyn's body. With calculated cruelty, he set her on fire. Flames quickly engulfed the room, the acrid smoke filling the air. Evelyn, still alive after the initial beating, was left to suffer unimaginable pain as the fire spread. The brutality of the attack stunned investigators later, not only for its suddenness but for the sheer intent to obliterate evidence through fire. Jorge's actions suggested a desperate attempt to destroy traces of his crime, even though his fingerprints and presence would ultimately betray him. The lead installer, still outside, noticed smoke and hurried back into the home. What he saw was chaos. Evelyn gravely injured, flames spreading, and Jorge agitated in the aftermath of the assault. Emergency services were called immediately. Firefighters and paramedics rushed to the scene, battling both the blaze and the race to save Evelyn's life. She was transported to Delray Medical Center, but her injuries were catastrophic. Despite the efforts of medical staff, she could not be saved. Evelyn's death was pronounced, and the case instantly shifted from a bizarre house fire to a homicide investigation. Detectives from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office arrived to find a scene of horror. The laundry room was charred, the washer and dryer blackened by flames that had burned hot and fast. On the floor lay evidence that told the story in chilling detail. The rubber mallet, partially scorched but still intact, and the container that once held the accelerant. Forensic teams meticulously examined the items, uncovering Jorge's fingerprints. His presence was undeniable, and the narrative he attempted to spin unraveled under the weight of physical evidence. Witness testimony from the lead installer further placed him at the center of the attack, confirming that he had been alone with Evelyn during the crucial minutes when the violence occurred. The arrest of Jorge Dupré Lachazzo followed swiftly. He was taken into custody, his mugshot capturing the face of a young man whose future had been obliterated by a senseless act of violence. At 21, Jorge had no direct ties to Evelyn, no history of disputes with her, and no rational explanation for why he turned an ordinary delivery into a murder scene. Initial reports revealed claims that he had ingested cocaine mixed with other substances prior to the crime, an attempt by defense attorneys to explain his erratic behavior. But prosecutors were quick to counter. Intoxication could not excuse deliberate actions, nor could it erase the fact that Evelyn had been beaten and set on fire in her own home. For the Udall family, the news was shattering. Evelyn's children and grandchildren, scattered across the country, rushed to Florida in disbelief. Their matriarch, the woman who had nurtured them with wisdom and love, was gone in an instant, taken by a man they had never known. Friends and neighbors gathered, lighting candles and leaving flowers in memory of a woman who had given so much to others. The shockwaves extended beyond Boca Raton, reaching national news outlets that reported on the bizarre and brutal crime. How could a simple delivery turn into a deadly encounter? How could trust, given so freely, be so viciously betrayed? In the early stages of the investigation, detectives dug into Jorge's background. They found no long history of violent crime, no deep-seated feud with Evelyn, nothing to suggest premeditation beyond the moment itself. He was described as a troubled young man, working a delivery job that provided modest income. Yet beneath that surface lay the capacity for a sudden explosion of brutality, one that would change his life and extinguish another's. Prosecutors immediately began building their case, confident that the fingerprints, the murder weapon, and the accelerant would lead to a conviction. As the community mourned, attention turned to the broader implications. Evelyn's death raised urgent questions about consumer safety and the responsibility of corporations when sending workers into private homes. Families began to wonder who, exactly, was being trusted at their front doors. Could these tragedies be prevented with stricter background checks or better supervision? Or was this simply an unforeseeable act of evil that no system could fully prevent? For many, the crime was not just about Jorge and Evelyn but about a larger, unsettling truth. Even the most ordinary interactions carried hidden risks. This was only the beginning of a case that would wind through courtrooms, stir debates, and haunt the memory of those who loved Evelyn Smith-Udall. The story of her life and the shocking circumstances of her death would soon unfold in detail before a jury, where the search for justice collided with the senselessness of the crime itself. In the days following Evelyn's death, investigators began piecing together the timeline of what had happened inside her Boca Raton home. The fire, though limited in scope, had left behind clear evidence. The accelerant container bore Jorge Dupré Lachazzo's fingerprints, as did the rubber mallet discovered in the laundry room. Forensic specialists confirmed that the burns on Evelyn's body aligned with the chemical residue found at the scene. There was no mystery about who had attacked her. The question that lingered was why. Neighbors told reporters that Evelyn had been in good spirits the morning of the delivery, mentioning her excitement about replacing her appliances. Nothing seemed unusual until the commotion began. Smoke rising, emergency sirens wailing, and the sickening realization that violence had erupted in the most ordinary of settings. When detectives questioned Jorge after his arrest, his statements shifted. At first, he denied harming Evelyn, insisting that something had gone wrong and that he panicked. Later, under pressure, he admitted to striking her but claimed he had no memory of setting her on fire. His defense attorneys soon introduced the argument that he had ingested cocaine laced with other substances earlier that morning, impairing his judgment. To them, his violent outburst was less an act of calculated intent and more the unpredictable chaos of a mind altered by drugs. But prosecutors saw it differently. They believed his actions, retrieving the mallet, striking Evelyn, fetching accelerant, and igniting flames, spoke of conscious choices. The notion that drugs absolved him of responsibility did not diminish the pain inflicted on Evelyn or the horror witnessed in her final moments. As the case prepared for trial, Evelyn's family remained at the center of the tragedy. Her husband, children, and grandchildren struggled with the absence of the woman who had anchored their lives. Friends remembered her as someone who was quick to smile, someone who celebrated others' successes and offered comfort during hardships. Former colleagues from her years in higher education wrote tributes, recalling her professionalism and the countless students she had mentored. The ripple effect of her loss could not be overstated. The courtroom would later hear these testimonies, voices of grief and remembrance that painted Evelyn not just as a victim, but as a vibrant individual cruelly taken from those who loved her. The prosecution built its case meticulously. They had strong physical evidence, the fingerprints, the burn patterns, the testimony of the lead installer who left the room briefly and returned to chaos. They also had the timeline, demonstrating that Jorge had the opportunity and means to carry out the attack in the short window when he was alone with Evelyn. To strengthen their argument, they emphasized the brutality. It was not just a killing but one accompanied by fire, an attempt to erase traces of the crime or perhaps inflict even greater suffering. The charges reflected this: first-degree murder, arson, and burglary with assault. Each carried heavy penalties and combined, they could lock Jorge away for life. Defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. Their strategy revolved around diminishing intent. They pointed to Jorge's age, just 21 at the time, and to the possibility that drugs had clouded his judgment. They argued that he had no history of violence and no reason to target Evelyn specifically. To them, the crime was the tragic result of poor choices, substance abuse, and impaired thinking, not premeditation. But even as they spoke, the jurors were confronted with photographs of the crime scene, images of the burned laundry room, and the searing accounts of Evelyn's final suffering. For many, the defense's narrative could not reconcile with the calculated cruelty of what had been done. While the legal battle unfolded, the community of Boca Raton reeled. News stations reported updates daily, framing the crime as a cautionary tale about the risks of allowing strangers into one's home. People questioned the vetting processes of large companies like Best Buy, who often relied on subcontractors to carry out deliveries. Could this tragedy have been prevented with stricter background checks, better training, or closer oversight of workers? Consumer advocacy groups seized on the story, urging reforms to ensure that vulnerable individuals, especially the elderly, were not left at risk. The crime exposed cracks in a system many had taken for granted. Customers assumed safety when scheduling home services, but Evelyn's case showed that assumption could prove deadly. The trial itself stretched over weeks, drawing local and national attention. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn's family faced Jorge across the aisle, forced to relive the nightmare in excruciating detail. Witnesses described the day of the delivery, the fire, and the frantic emergency response. Forensic experts walked the jury through the evidence, highlighting the damning fingerprints. Prosecutors reminded the jurors of Evelyn's vulnerability, her willingness to trust, and the way that trust had been exploited in the most violent manner. Each word was delivered with the weight of finality. This was not a crime of chance, they argued, but a crime of intent. Jorge sat quietly through much of the proceedings, his youth striking against the gravity of the accusations. At moments, he appeared detached, at others remorseful, but the jury's focus remained on the facts. The defense's claims of intoxication were undermined by the sequence of actions he had taken. He had not only attacked Evelyn but escalated his violence with fire. This, prosecutors insisted, was not the mark of someone lost in a haze, but of someone making devastating choices. When the defense sought to humanize Jorge, pointing to his difficult upbringing and lack of criminal history, prosecutors countered with Evelyn's life story, a woman who had dedicated herself to uplifting others, now extinguished by his hand. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. In 2022, after lengthy deliberations, the jury found Jorge Dupré Lachazo guilty of first-degree murder, arson, and burglary with assault. The courtroom was silent as the words were read, broken only by the muffled sobs of Evelyn's loved ones. The sentence was severe but unsurprising: life in prison without parole. For Evelyn's family, it was a measure of justice, though nothing could fill the void left by her absence. For Jorge, it was the end of his life as he knew it. 21 years old at the time of the crime, condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Many felt justice had been served, that the punishment matched the cruelty of the crime. Others reflected on the senselessness, wondering how such violence could erupt from what should have been a mundane encounter. For Boca Raton, the trial brought closure but also lingering unease. The city that once felt insulated from such brutality now carried the memory of a crime that had shattered its sense of security. Evelyn's death remained a scar, a reminder that evil could enter through the front door in the guise of service. As the media coverage slowed, Evelyn's family began the slow process of healing. Memorials were held, and scholarships were established in her name to honor her commitment to education. Friends and neighbors continued to speak of her kindness, ensuring her legacy endured. In contrast, Jorge disappeared into the prison system, his name remembered only in connection to the crime. The story of that August day lived on in two opposing legacies, one of love and generosity, the other of violence and destruction. Even with the trial concluded, questions lingered. What triggered Jorge's sudden attack? Was it truly drugs, an impulse, or something darker within him? Investigators never uncovered a clear motive, leaving the crime shrouded in mystery. For many, that lack of explanation was the most haunting element of all. Evelyn had opened her door in trust, and what came next defied reason. The senselessness of it made the crime not only brutal but incomprehensible, a story that offered no answers, only loss. The conviction of Jorge Dupré Lachazo marked the legal end of the case, but for many, it was only the beginning of reckoning with the deeper implications of Evelyn Udel's murder. Courtrooms deliver verdicts, but communities live with the echoes, and in Boca Raton those echoes lingered long after the gavel fell. Evelyn's death was not simply another statistic. It was a rupture in the fabric of ordinary life. She had represented the best of her generation, educated, community-oriented, family-driven, and her murder revealed how quickly trust could be violated in spaces assumed to be safe. The Udel family carried the heaviest burden. Evelyn's husband, once accustomed to sharing each morning with her, now faced silence where her voice had been. Her children, adults with families of their own, described how the loss radiated into every corner of their lives. Holidays felt incomplete, milestones dulled by absence. Her grandchildren, too young to fully understand the details, were left with fragments of memory and stories told by others about the grandmother who had loved them fiercely. Grief is always personal, but in Evelyn's case it also became public, her life and death recounted in news segments, courtroom transcripts, and advocacy campaigns. Each retelling carried both a reminder of her warmth and the brutal way it was extinguished. The trial's aftermath sparked broader discussions about consumer safety and corporate responsibility. Best Buy, though not directly accused of wrongdoing, faced criticism for outsourcing deliveries to third-party contractors like John's Appliance City. Customers had assumed that workers entering their homes had undergone rigorous screening, but Evelyn's case revealed gaps in the system. Questions emerged. How thoroughly were delivery workers vetted? Were background checks consistent? Was there oversight to ensure that young men like Jorge were fit for entering private homes, especially those of elderly customers? While Jorge had no serious prior criminal record, the fact remained that corporations held the power to determine who was entrusted with such access. Evelyn's murder became a catalyst for consumer advocacy groups calling for stricter regulations and greater transparency in how delivery and installation personnel were hired and supervised. For law enforcement, the case underscored how quickly ordinary circumstances could escalate into extraordinary violence. Detectives admitted the difficulty of investigating crimes that seemed motiveless. Unlike disputes rooted in financial gain, jealousy, or revenge, Evelyn's murder defied easy categorization. Jorge had no personal history with her, no reason to harbor animosity. Theories about drug use provided a partial explanation, but they could not fully account for the level of brutality displayed. To prosecutors, the lack of motive only made the crime more chilling. If something so random could happen to Evelyn, then no one felt entirely immune. Media coverage continued to revisit the case, framing it as both a true crime story and a cautionary tale. Documentaries and news specials dissected the timeline, from the morning delivery to the courtroom verdict, presenting Evelyn's story to audiences far beyond Boca Raton. Her face appeared on screens across the country, not as an anonymous victim but as a mother and grandmother whose trust was betrayed. Jorge's image, too, circulated widely. His mugshot a stark reminder of a life derailed at 21, consumed by an act that offered no path to redemption. These portrayals cemented the narrative, one of senseless loss, unthinkable violence, and the fragile boundaries between safety and danger in everyday interactions. Inside prison walls, Jorge's future was already written. Sentenced to life without parole, he became one of many young men whose choices had led to permanent confinement. Accounts from the courtroom suggested moments of remorse, but they did little to ease the pain of Evelyn's family. For them, remorse could not rewrite the past or restore what had been taken. The life sentence was a form of justice, but it was also a reminder of the permanence of the crime. 2 lives had been destroyed that day. Evelyn's ended in horror, and Jorge's, locked away behind steel and concrete. As the years passed, Evelyn's loved ones sought ways to preserve her memory beyond the narrative of her murder. Memorials were created in her honor, scholarships established to continue her lifelong dedication to education. These efforts provided a measure of comfort, allowing her name to be associated not only with tragedy, but also with opportunity and hope. Former colleagues shared stories of her mentorship, ensuring that new generations of students understood the kind of person she had been. In these acts of remembrance, Evelyn's legacy resisted being overshadowed by the violence of her death. The community, too, carried lessons forward. Neighbors became more cautious about letting strangers into their homes, even for routine services. Some households began requesting multiple workers or scheduling deliveries only when family members could be present. Companies in the region reevaluated their subcontracting practices, aware that public trust could no longer be assumed. Though these changes could not undo the past, they reflected an acknowledgement of the vulnerabilities Evelyn's case had exposed. Her death had forced both individuals and institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about safety and responsibility. In retelling the story, one cannot ignore the contrast between Evelyn and Jorge, two lives intersecting by chance in a way that would alter both forever. Evelyn, 75, at the end of a long and meaningful career, surrounded by family and friends who adored her. Jorge, 21, standing at the beginning of adulthood, with no history suggesting he was capable of such cruelty. Their encounter should have been fleeting, an exchange of polite conversation over the installation of appliances. Instead, it became fatal. That contrast remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. How quickly routine can twist into catastrophe, how fragile the line between ordinary life and tragedy truly is. For those who continue to tell Evelyn's story, the focus often returns to her character rather than the crime. She is remembered not simply as a victim, but as a woman whose generosity and intellect left a mark on everyone she met. Her name lives on in family gatherings, in the scholarships bearing her memory, and in the collective determination of her community to honor her with action. Jorge's name, by contrast, serves as a cautionary marker of squandered youth, a reminder of how violence destroys not only its targets but also those who commit it. In the final measure, the murder of Evelyn Smith-Udall stands as a reminder of vulnerability in unexpected places. It is a story that warns of the dangers of unchecked trust, but also underscores the resilience of memory and love. The brutality of her death cannot erase the decades of kindness and achievement that defined her life. Instead, her family and community have chosen to let her legacy endure, overshadowing the cruelty of the act with the warmth of the woman she was. The quiet home in Boca Raton where the crime occurred no longer bears the marks of fire and violence. Its walls have been repaired, its rooms restored. But for those who knew Evelyn, the memory of that day remains vivid. It is a memory of sirens and smoke, of headlines that seemed unreal, of the devastating phone calls that changed lives forever. Yet within that memory also lies determination, to ensure she is remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. And so, in the retelling of her story, amid the horror of what happened, there is also light, the enduring reminder that even in tragedy, love and legacy can outlast violence. In May 2022, a quiet Canadian city was shattered when a respected restaurant manager was killed after a sudden street altercation. What began as an ordinary night spiraled into tragedy, leaving one man dead, another accused of murder, and a community demanding answers. This is the story. On the evening of May 28, 2022, the city of Prince Albert in Saskatchewan was still carrying the quiet routine of a late spring weekend. Families were gathering for dinners, restaurants were busy with the ebb and flow of customers, and in a community where faces were familiar, most people thought they knew what to expect from a Saturday night. What they did not expect was that the night would end with one man lying fatally injured after an altercation and another being led away in handcuffs, facing one of the most serious charges in Canadian criminal law. The victim was 37-year-old Alan Andres, a man many in Prince Albert recognized not only as a restaurant manager but as a figure who seemed woven into the social fabric of the town. He worked long shifts, kept his staff motivated, and had the kind of calm temperament that made him a natural leader in the often hectic environment of the service industry. Alan had earned respect in subtle ways. His ability to handle difficult customers without losing patience, his loyalty to his coworkers, and his commitment to family life outside the workplace. To those who knew him personally, he was more than a manager. He was a dependable friend and a provider who understood the weight of responsibility. On the other side of the story was 23-year-old Rajdeepsinh Baihola, a young man who had come to Canada in search of better opportunities. His life, like many newcomers, was marked by transition and adjustment. He picked up jobs wherever he could, including work as a food delivery driver with Skip the Dishes, moving around the city on his bike or car, delivering orders to strangers. Delivery work was not glamorous, but it was steady enough to help him meet expenses. To acquaintances, Rajdeep appeared like any other young worker in Prince Albert, trying to carve out his space in a community that could sometimes feel indifferent to outsiders. At the time of the incident, he was not on a delivery shift, yet his identity as a delivery driver would be highlighted in media and courtroom discussions, almost as though it represented the intersection of the ordinary and the catastrophic in this case. The events that brought these two men into violent conflict remain partially shrouded by the limitations of witness accounts and the legal caution surrounding ongoing trials. But what is known is that on May 28th, outside a business area, Alan and Rajdeep crossed paths. It was not a planned meeting, nor was there any known history between them. Witnesses described a sudden escalation, an argument that began with words and quickly turned into something far more dangerous. Raised voices drew attention, and within moments, shoving and physical struggle replaced whatever verbal dispute had ignited. By the time the confrontation ended, Alan lay critically injured. Emergency responders arrived and transported him to hospital, but the injuries he had sustained proved too severe. Not long after, Alan was pronounced dead. The death sent immediate shockwaves across the community. A restaurant manager, someone many people had interacted with casually or worked alongside, had become the victim of a violent encounter in a city that prided itself on small-town familiarity. Local news outlets quickly carried the story, framing it as a tragedy that disrupted the calm of an ordinary evening. At the same time, police moved swiftly to identify and apprehend a suspect. Within hours, Rajdeep Singh Bihola was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is a charge that carries grave weight in Canada. It implies that the accused intended to cause the death of the victim or intended to cause bodily harm that was likely to lead to death, but without the element of premeditation required for first-degree murder. In other words, it is often associated with acts that escalate quickly, born out of rage or sudden conflict rather than long-planned malice. For investigators and prosecutors, the question was not whether Alan died at Rajdeep's hands, that was evident, but rather whether the intent behind his actions justified the charge and how a court would interpret the moments leading up to the fatal outcome. In the days that followed, the identities of the two men became central to how the story was told and understood. For Alan's family and friends, grief was compounded by disbelief. They remembered him as patient, level-headed, the sort of person who avoided unnecessary confrontations. The idea that he had been pulled into a fight that ended his life seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the man they knew. They gathered outside the restaurant he managed, leaving flowers, notes, and photos as a tribute to the life he had lived and the sudden void his absence created. For Rajdeep, the focus was on how a young immigrant with no clear history of violent crime could find himself at the center of a case this serious. Court documents revealed that he had been living in Prince Albert for only a short time. His life was not one of luxury or influence but rather of trying to find footing in a city that often saw delivery drivers and temporary workers as part of its invisible workforce. To some, his arrest reinforced stereotypes about young men from immigrant backgrounds caught in violence. To others, it raised uncomfortable questions about what circumstances or pressures could push someone into a confrontation that spiraled fatally out of control. As police released details, the public wanted to know what had sparked the argument. Was it random? Was there an underlying dispute? Had words been exchanged earlier that day? The answers remained elusive, as investigators chose their disclosures carefully, citing the need to preserve the integrity of the trial. What was shared was that witnesses heard shouting and saw the men in a heated exchange. The physical clash appeared brief, but the consequences were irreversible. In the justice system, the case began to move forward. Rajdeep appeared in court, his image captured in news outlets as he stood behind glass panels during his preliminary hearings. For many, it was the first time they saw the man accused of killing Alan Andres, and reactions were mixed. Some looked at him with anger, seeing only the figure responsible for taking away a beloved community member. Others, perhaps more distantly, recognized the complexity of a young man's life now entangled in the machinery of the criminal courts. Behind the courtroom drama, Alan's family was left with a different reality. They had to navigate grief while attending hearings, listening to details of the confrontation that killed their son, brother, or friend. Each new piece of evidence presented was a reminder of the suddenness with which life can change. Alan had gone to work that day like any other. He managed staff, greeted customers, likely made plans for the rest of the weekend. Yet, by nightfall, he was in a hospital bed, and by morning, his name was etched into headlines as a victim of homicide. The community's response was marked by both outrage and sadness. Vigils were held, and community leaders spoke of the need for peace and restraint in conflicts. The story became part of local conversations about safety in public spaces, about how quickly ordinary disputes can turn lethal, and about the fragility of assumptions that violence is always distant, belonging to larger cities or darker corners of society. In Prince Albert, people were forced to confront the reality that even here, on an ordinary street, under familiar lights, the worst could happen. This was the beginning of a case that would unfold over months, through hearings, evidence, testimony, and arguments that would attempt to piece together the truth of those few chaotic minutes. For now, the central fact remained inescapable. One man was gone, another stood accused of his murder, and a city was left to grapple with the consequences of violence erupting in a place where routine should have ruled. The aftermath of Alan Andres' death stretched beyond a crime scene report or a single evening's tragedy. It became an unfolding story that dominated Prince Albert in the months that followed. The city, already grappling with its own struggles around crime and safety, found itself transfixed by the details of a confrontation that no one fully understood. What had led a respected restaurant manager and a young delivery driver, two men with seemingly no connection, into a violent altercation that left one dead and the other facing the rest of his life under the shadow of a murder charge. As the justice system began its slow march forward, the questions deepened, pulling more people into the orbit of a case that showed no signs of fading from public memory. The preliminary hearings became the first real window into what happened that night. The Crown presented witness testimony that captured the volatility of the encounter. Those who had been in the area remembered hearing raised voices, anger carried on the street like an alarm bell, and then the swift escalation into a physical struggle. One witness described Alan as defensive, trying to ward off the aggression, while another recalled Rajdeepsingh advancing in a way that seemed charged with frustration or desperation. But as with all eyewitness accounts, details conflicted. The defense seized on these inconsistencies, suggesting that what occurred was not a straightforward act of violence, but a sudden clash that spiraled out of control, lacking clear intent. Medical professionals were called to testify about the injuries Alan sustained. Their descriptions were clinical, but the implications were devastating. The nature of the wounds indicated force and intent, but whether that intent was to kill or merely to lash out in a moment of anger remained the point of contention. The hospital staff who had fought to save Alan's life recounted their efforts with quiet professionalism, but their words underscored the irreversible reality of the outcome. For Alan's family, hearing these details was like reopening a wound that had barely begun to close. Alan's loved ones became silent fixtures in the courtroom. His parents, siblings, and close friends attended hearings, their presence a constant reminder of the life that had been lost. Each session of testimony was an exercise in endurance, as they sat through descriptions of the final moments of a man they remembered in far gentler ways. To them, Alan was not the victim in a file or a name in court transcripts. He was the dependable son who called to check in, the brother who offered advice, the friend who kept gatherings lighthearted. In the courtroom, however, those dimensions of his life were compressed into exhibits, statements, and legal arguments. Rajdeepsingh, by contrast, was a solitary figure in the proceedings. When he appeared in court, dressed in plain clothing provided during custody, his demeanor alternated between stoicism and visible anxiety. He listened to translators and lawyers speak on his behalf, often lowering his gaze as details of the confrontation were recounted. His defense lawyers sought to emphasize his youth, his lack of criminal history, and the circumstances of a life marked by adjustment to a new country. To them, he was not a cold-blooded killer but a man caught in a situation that spiraled faster than he could control, perhaps compounded by cultural misunderstandings, stress, or personal struggles invisible to the public eye. The Crown, however, presented him in sharper terms. They highlighted the seriousness of the charge, pointing to the fact that Alan had been unarmed and that the escalation was disproportionate. To the prosecutors, Rajdeepsingh's actions could not be excused as a mere accident of temper. They argued that when a confrontation ends in death, the responsibility lies squarely with the aggressor. The courtroom, as always, became a battlefield of narratives. One side portraying a young immigrant who made a catastrophic mistake, the other framing him as a man whose choices crossed a line from anger to lethal violence. Beyond the courtroom, the city itself was still reeling. Prince Albert's restaurant community, in particular, felt the loss acutely. Alan had been a mentor to younger staff, a manager who set high standards while still showing kindness. His absence left not only a hole in the business but also in the culture of those who worked alongside him. Some employees struggled to return to their routines, haunted by the knowledge that the man who once guided them through difficult shifts was now a victim whose story was playing out in the media. Regular customers, too, felt the void. Many recalled Alan by name, speaking about his steady presence during countless meals, now interrupted forever. For Rajdeepsina's acquaintances, the situation was bewildering. Those who had interacted with him during deliveries or through casual connections described him as quiet, polite, even reserved. The idea that he could be involved in such a violent incident seemed incongruent with their experiences. Yet, as the trial preparations advanced, people were reminded that individuals are often more complex than surface impressions. The duality of Rajdeep's life, immigrant worker and accused murderer, became part of the broader narrative, with media reports carefully walking the line between fact and speculation. The legal process itself was slow, deliberate, and emotionally draining for all involved. Preliminary hearings established that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, ensuring that the case would not quietly fade away. Each delay, each scheduling of new dates, stretched out the uncertainty for the families. Alan's relatives longed for closure, for a verdict that would at least give structure to their grief, while Rajdeep's family, likely watching from afar, held on to the fragile hope that his actions might be framed as less than intentional murder. The wait became its own kind of torment, as lives remained suspended in the shadow of the upcoming trial. Media coverage amplified the case's impact. Local outlets published photos of Alan, smiling in snapshots from better days, alongside images of Rajdeep in custody. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the crime, the contrast between victim and accused, and the unsettling reality that ordinary disputes can end in irreversible tragedy. For Prince Albert residents, reading the updates became part of daily life, a reminder that violence had pierced their community in a way that felt deeply personal. As the months wore on, the legal arguments sharpened. Prosecutors assembled their case around intent, determined to demonstrate that Rajdeepsina's actions were deliberate enough to warrant the charge of second-degree murder. The defense, in turn, refined their narrative of escalation, arguing that Alan's death, though tragic, was the result of a confrontation that spun out of control rather than a premeditated act of malice. Both sides knew the stakes were immense. A conviction could mean life-altering consequences for Rajdeep, while anything less than murder might feel to Alan's family like a denial of justice. The community's sense of unease deepened as the case moved toward trial. The crime was no longer a single story on the news but a symbol of fragility in human interactions. People found themselves questioning how quickly anger can turn into violence, how a few words can ignite something irreparable, and how two lives, one ended, one derailed, could alter the lives of so many others. For Prince Albert, it was not just about the legal outcome but about reckoning with the fact that tragedy had unfolded in their own streets, in their own time, under circumstances that could so easily have involved anyone. As the preliminary hearings concluded and the case was prepared for full trial, both families braced for the difficult months ahead. Alan's relatives clung to the memory of a man who had embodied patience and decency, hoping that the justice system would honor his life through accountability. Rajdeepsina's family, meanwhile, waited in anguish, their son and brother reduced in the public eye to an accused murderer, his future balanced on the scales of the court. The stage was set for the trial to begin, where every word, every testimony, and every piece of evidence would be dissected in the pursuit of truth. When the trial for the death of Alan Andres finally began, Prince Albert turned its collective attention to the courtroom. What had once been speculation or incomplete fragments of information became formal proceedings, presented with the weight of evidence, testimony, and legal argument. For Alan's family, it was the culmination of a year of grief and waiting. For Rajdeepsina Bihola, it was the moment that would decide whether he would spend the next decades behind bars or emerge with a different, though still tarnished, future. The case, stripped of rumor and reduced to facts and interpretation, revealed itself as a complex story of a fatal altercation in which every second mattered. The Crown laid out its case with precision, seeking to convince jurors that Rajdeepsing's actions on May 28, 2022, were not just reckless but deliberate enough to warrant a conviction for second-degree murder. Prosecutors emphasized the disproportionate force used during the altercation, the vulnerability of the victim, and the irreversible consequences of Rajdeep's decisions. They called witnesses who had seen the fight unfold. Some described Alan attempting to defend himself, raising his arms in an effort to de-escalate, while others remembered Rajdeep moving forward aggressively. The Crown wove these accounts into a narrative of responsibility, arguing that Rajdeep had opportunities to walk away but instead chose escalation. Medical experts were again pivotal. Their testimony about Alan's injuries painted a grim picture of the violence involved. They explained how the trauma inflicted on him left little chance of survival, even with immediate medical intervention. The testimony was clinical, but its weight in the courtroom was crushing. It underscored the reality that Alan had not simply collapsed in the midst of a scuffle. His death was the result of targeted, damaging force. For the jury, these details were essential in determining whether the outcome could be considered accidental or whether it bore the hallmarks of intentional harm. The defense countered by focusing on context. They portrayed Rajdeepsingh as a young man under stress, grappling with life in a new country, financial strain, and a moment of anger that spiraled out of control. They did not deny his involvement but sought to reframe it. To them, Alan's death was a tragedy of circumstance rather than malice. The defense questioned the reliability of eyewitness accounts, highlighting inconsistencies in their descriptions of who initiated the fight or how quickly it escalated. They argued that Rajdeep had not left his home that day with murder in mind. Instead, he had been swept into a conflict that escalated beyond his ability to manage. Rajdeepsingh himself did not take the stand, a decision that left his demeanor throughout the trial open to interpretation. He sat quietly beside his lawyers, often avoiding eye contact with Alan's family, sometimes staring into the middle distance as though searching for a way to process the weight of his reality. To some jurors, his silence may have appeared calculated. To others, it might have reflected shock, fear, or resignation. In the silence, people projected their own interpretations of guilt, remorse, or detachment. For Alan's family, the trial was a second ordeal. Sitting through testimony that dissected his final moments was excruciating. They had already lived with the grief of his loss. Now they were forced to confront its details in a sterile courtroom where their brother, son, or friend was reduced to exhibits and diagrams. Their presence, however, was unwavering. They became the silent moral center of the proceedings, a reminder that this case was not merely about law but about the real human cost of violence. Their grief stood as unspoken testimony, shaping the atmosphere of the trial even without words. As the days stretched on, the tension in the courtroom mounted. Closing arguments crystallized the opposing views. The Crown insisted that Alan's death could not be excused as an accident, that Rajdeep's actions had crossed a line into criminal intent, and that justice demanded a conviction for second-degree murder. The defense pleaded for nuance, urging jurors to see the incident as a spontaneous eruption of conflict, tragic but not premeditated, and deserving of a lesser conviction such as manslaughter. The decision, a moment that would define the lives of everyone involved. The verdict brought finality, though not peace. For Alan's family, there was relief in seeing responsibility acknowledged, but no ruling could bring back the man they had lost. They left the courtroom knowing that justice had been served in the technical sense, but also aware that the hole in their lives would remain unfilled. For Rajdeepsingh, the verdict marked the end of uncertainty but the beginning of a different kind of life, one framed by incarceration and the weight of knowing that a moment of violence had destroyed not only another man's future but his own. In the weeks that followed, the city reflected on what had transpired. Commentators wrote about the fragility of human temper, how arguments that last seconds can alter lives forever. Some focused on Alan's legacy, recalling the man who had kept a restaurant running with warmth and steadiness. Others looked at Rajdeep's story as a cautionary tale of how unresolved pressures and poor decisions can culminate in irreversible acts. The case became part of community dialogue about conflict resolution, the risks of escalation, and the importance of recognizing when to step away. For those closest to Alan, life after the trial was marked by attempts to rebuild. His restaurant colleagues carried on, though his absence lingered in every shift. His family organized memorials that celebrated his life rather than focusing solely on its violent end, ensuring that his name was remembered for more than the courtroom battle. For Rajdeep's family, the outcome was devastating in a different way. They carried the weight of stigma and sorrow, knowing that their son's actions had destroyed another family while also ending his own path to stability in Canada. The story of May 28, 2022, in Prince Albert was more than a crime. It was a lesson etched into the collective memory of the city. It reminded people that violence does not always arrive in dramatic, cinematic form. Sometimes it emerges from chance encounters, ordinary places, and fleeting moments of anger. The tragedy of Alan Andres' death lay not only in its brutality but also in its preventability, in the reality that both men could have walked away before it reached the point of no return. By the time the case closed, what remained were two families bound forever by a single night. One mourned a loved one taken too soon, the other mourned the future that might have been. The court provided a verdict, but the community was left with questions that could never be fully answered. Why did words turn to violence? What could have stopped the escalation? And how does a city reconcile with a tragedy that unfolded not in some distant place but on its own streets? Prince Albert moved on in the way communities always do, with time softening the edges of shock. Yet for those who had known Alan Andres, or who had watched the trial of Rajdeep Bihola, the memory remained sharp. It served as both a cautionary tale and a solemn reminder that lives can change in an instant, that justice can only go so far, and that the real cost of violence is carried not in verdicts or headlines, but in the quiet grief of those left behind.